Hello, and welcome back. Tonight, we drift into the shadowed silk tents of a man whose name once echoed across continents. Genghis Khan, a conqueror not only of lands, but of hearts, chambers, and centuries of whispered legend. Did he really have 500 wives? What secrets slept beside him, and how did desire shape an empire? Close your eyes and picture a moonlit steppe, a tent glowing from within, the scent of incense, and the quiet rustle of royal silks. Let your thoughts wander. And before we begin, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Don't forget to subscribe if you'd like more sleepy journeys into strange history. You've probably heard the claim, 1 in every 200 men alive today carries the genetic marker of Genghis Khan. It's one of history's most repeated fun facts. But where does this claim actually come from? And how true is it? The myth began in 2003 when a genetic study of men across Asia revealed a startling pattern. A particular Y chromosome lineage appeared in about 8% of men in a large region stretching from northeast China to Uzbekistan, roughly 16 million men at the time. The researchers traced this genetic trail back about 1,000 years, and they speculated it may have originated with a single prolific male in Mongolia. From there, speculation ran wild. Who else could it be but Genghis Khan, the man who built the largest land empire in history and reportedly maintained hundreds of wives and concubines? The theory gained traction for one simple reason: it fit the narrative. We already knew Genghis Khan had numerous sexual partners, many through conquest. His descendants ruled vast territories: China, Persia, Central Asia, for generations, giving them plenty of opportunity to spread their bloodline. He had male heirs, who had male heirs, who had more male heirs. The numbers snowballed, but still does. The presence of a common Y chromosome proved paternity. Not quite. Y chromosomes are passed from father to son, so they are useful in tracing male line ancestry, but they don't carry names or titles. The lineage, identified in the 2003 study, wasn't directly labeled Khan. It was simply a statistical cluster, very common Y marker, shared across millions of men. That's not proof of identity. It's just a pattern, further complicating the matter. That same genetic signature could have originated with any powerful warlord who fathered many sons in the same region and era. The Mongol Empire wasn't the only state expanding in the 13th century. There were Turkic Khans, tribal chiefs, and local warlords who ruled swaths of land and practiced similar polygamy. It could have been someone else entirely, and yet the legend sticks. Why? Because it feels right. It supports the story we've built of Genghis Khan as the ultimate conqueror, not just of land and people, but of flesh and bloodlines. The idea that his DNA flows in millions of men today adds a personal, even primal layer to his legacy. It makes history feel like it's still living inside us. But that also leads to a deeper question. Do we carry his memory because of what he did, or because of what we want him to represent? It's easy to get swept up in the drama of statistics: 16 million men, a single bloodline, a conqueror who left a genetic echo across half of Asia. But numbers, like empires, are not always what they seem. There's a reason we question this. Legacy. First, the number 500 wives and concubines is not recorded in any official Mongol court documents. It's repeated in later Persian and Chinese sources, often second-hand or decades after Genghis Khan's death. Many of these chroniclers were more interested in moral judgments or exaggeration than strict census-taking. In the absence of concrete records, numbers grew large simply because they were meant to. Likewise, the famous 2003 genetic study, though peer-reviewed, was based on a sample of only a few thousand men, many from isolated communities. From that small dataset, the idea that millions of men share a Khan marker was a projected estimation, not a confirmed lineage. Genetics can show similarity, but they can't prove the historical behavior that caused it. And there's another wrinkle. Male line inheritance of a Y chromosome doesn't account for much of a population's total DNA. Genghis Khan may have had many children, but they would have competed with thousands of other lineages. Over time, bloodlines dilute. Even in royal families, marriages branch out, names vanish, and power shifts. If anything, the continued dominance of a single Y chromosome across centuries might say more about social systems like feudal patriarchy and elite polygamy than about one man's libido. There's also the matter of historical context. While Genghis Khan had sons, only 4 were considered legitimate, born to his chief wife, Bert. His other sons, born of concubines and secondary wives, had status but not always power. Some died young, others faded from the record. His grandsons, like Kublai Khan and Hulagu, certainly expanded his legacy. But did they all pass down his DNA? Possibly, but not necessarily. What's more likely is that Genghis Khan became a symbol, a name attached to a trend. The genetic data simply tells us that one male lineage prospered greatly in the Mongol heartlands and spread outward. Whether that man was Temujin, the historical Genghis Khan, or another powerful patriarch remains unconfirmed. Still, the myth persists because it's seductive. It gives us the illusion that power leaves permanent traces, not just in ruins or books, but in our very cells. But if bloodlines can fade, what does it truly mean to live forever? You often hear the number 500 wives and concubines, as if it were just another footnote in the life of a conqueror. But numbers don't come from nowhere, and neither did the women. The women in Genghis Khan's orbit were not simply a result of desire. They were the outcome of conquest, treaties, customs, and politics. To understand this, you must look not at the man, but at the machine he built. When Mongol armies rode into cities and brought them to heel, the aftermath was always the same. Prisoners were taken, skilled workers relocated, and high-ranking women identified. Royal women daughters, queens, and sisters of defeated rulers were often presented to Genghis Khan as political gifts. Sometimes this was an act of submission. Other times, a desperate attempt to save their lives or preserve the honor of a defeated dynasty. These women entered the court not merely as captives, but as political instruments, married, absorbed, or enslaved, depending on rank and use. But not all women came from royal stock. Many were taken from nomadic clans or local towns during the long, dusty marches across Asia. The Khan's military campaigns spanned across dozens of tribes, cultures, and regions. Each conquest brought new wives, whether voluntary or not. The Mongol elite believed in the legitimacy of taking wives through victory, especially when it came to integrating local populations into the empire. Still, Genghis Khan wasn't alone in this practice. In steppe culture, polygamy was common, especially among Khans and tribal leaders. A powerful man could have multiple wives, each living in her own ordo, a mobile household, like a royal tent camp. The first wife, Bert, held the highest status. Others followed in a strict hierarchy. The title of wife could mean many things. Some were consorts with influence, others glorified servants. What often gets lost in the salacious headline, 500 wives, is the logistics. Where did they live? How were they fed? Who kept records? You'd be surprised to learn there were attendants, rotation systems, and administrators tasked with maintaining the women's schedules and needs. This wasn't simply a harem. It was an institution, managed like a department of state. Still, for all the documentation we have of conquests and treaties, the women themselves are mostly silent in the record. Their names are rarely preserved. Their voices even less so. So, it leaves us to wonder if you were one of those 500. How would you survive? And would your story ever be told? You might imagine Genghis Khan, surrounded by luxury, pillows, silk, and wine. But love in an empire was rarely about romance. It was routine, order, and control. The Khan's personal life was an extension of his governance. Even intimacy was scheduled, recorded, and enforced. His women, reportedly hundreds of wives and concubines, did not live in one place. Instead, each woman had her own mobile tented household with guards, servants, and supplies. These weren't mere sleeping quarters. They were mini-courts, complete with livestock, storage, and administration. Each ordo moved separately across the steppe, strategically placed along the Khan's travel routes so that he could visit them at will during seasonal migrations or campaigns. At the top of this intricate system was Bert, his first and most powerful wife. Only Bert's sons were considered legitimate heirs. The rest, while recognized, held different ranks based on their mother's position. This ranking affected everything from inheritance rights to military command. Even the order in which Genghis Khan spent his nights had political meaning. Women of higher rank were visited more frequently. Their children stood closer to power. A lesser concubine might never see him again after a single night. Still, she and her ordo would be maintained clothed, guarded, and provisioned for life. Why? Because neglecting a woman risked dishonor, rebellion, or even factional war. Logistically, the empire had a quiet bureaucracy tasked with managing all of this. Court eunuchs and senior wives maintained records. The Mongols, though often described as brutal, had incredibly sophisticated administrative habits. Births were recorded. Movements were tracked. Gifting patterns were logged. Even the number of mares assigned to each ordo for milk and transport was a state decision. Food supply was another challenge. Herds were rotated. Goods came from tribute routes, silk from China, spices from Central Asia, and grain from settled populations helped keep these courts running. Some ordos became rich in their own right, accumulating trade goods, artisans, even diplomats. But behind this machinery was something more difficult to measure: the emotional silence of the women themselves. No letters survive, no diaries, not even oral histories from their perspectives. The system served the state, not the self. They were honored, maintained, and forgotten, often all at once. And so we're left with a strange paradox. Genghis Khan, perhaps the most powerful man of his time, may have fathered hundreds of children, but knew few of them. His bedchamber stretched across thousands of miles, yet he slept alone more often than not, which leaves us wondering, in an empire built on closeness, conquest, and blood, was the heart of it always out of reach? When a city fell to Genghis Khan's armies, the world inside that city collapsed suddenly, brutally, and without mercy. Walls were torn down, libraries burned, noblemen executed. But among the spoils most prized were not just gold or horses, but women, especially the wives and daughters of kings, governors, and warlords. To the Mongols, capturing royal women was not merely about pleasure, it was about power. Taking the wife or daughter of a defeated ruler and making her part of your household was the ultimate humiliation of your enemy's symbolic act that transferred dynastic legitimacy, bloodlines, and authority. In steppe culture, as in many ancient societies, lineage and status were tied to marriage. When Genghis Khan or his sons took conquered women as wives or concubines, they weren't just expanding their households, they were absorbing the identity of the conquered. Some of these women were treated with a strange form of respect, preserved, married, even given their own ordo tent camp. Persian sources speak of royal princesses from the Khwarezmian Empire and Tangut dynasty being taken as wives shortly after their fathers were executed or their cities burned. These unions helped legitimize Mongol control over foreign populations. "You are ruled by us now," they seemed to say, "and even your daughters call us husband." But others weren't so fortunate. When lesser towns were taken without political utility, many women were distributed among commanders and soldiers, sometimes as rewards. Mongol law, the yasa, included loose guidelines for distributing prisoners, but it left many decisions to individual generals. Reports from Chinese and Persian chroniclers describe chaotic scenes after major battles, women branded, sorted by beauty or rank, and divided by lot. For the women, there was no script. Some were quietly absorbed into the empire's machinery, raised children, managed tents, perhaps even found favor. Others were never mentioned again, their names erased with their cities. What's especially haunting is how systematic the process became. This wasn't random brutality, it was procedure. A fallen royal woman could become a queen, a servant, or a ghost, depending on her use to the empire. And once absorbed, there was no way back, no escape, no return to her former name. So when a city heard the hoofbeats of the Mongols, its men feared the sword, but the women feared something slower, something quieter, a life that would continue, not end. And it raises a chilling thought. Is it better to be remembered through lineage, or to disappear in silence? In the Mongol world, marriage was more than tradition. It was diplomacy wrapped in silk, a tool sharper than the sword. Genghis Khan used it with remarkable precision. Where he conquered with armies, he ruled with wives, not just his own. Genghis Khan married his daughters and granddaughters to tribal chieftains, Persian nobles, and even former enemies. These alliances ensured that loyalty was sealed not just by fear, but by blood. But in return, he accepted the daughters of defeated kings, and that exchange often blurred the line between prisoner and princess. To many of these women, marriage was survival. A queen whose city had just burned had few options. Those who resisted often met a quick and brutal end. But those who submitted, especially women of royal birth, could be woven into the imperial court, sometimes gaining influence in unexpected ways. One example is Yasujin and Yasui, two sisters from the Tatars, a tribe once hostile to the Mongols. Both were captured and later married by Genghis Khan, but rather than being discarded, they became part of his inner circle. Yasui, in particular, is mentioned in some chronicles as a favored companion during his later campaigns. What began in blood became, oddly, stability. And yet, these marriages were never truly about the women. They were about absorbing their father's former power. A princess from the defeated Khwarezm Empire wasn't just beautiful, she was a symbol of conquest, of dynastic continuity now in Mongol hands. Marrying her sent a message: we have taken everything you were, including your future. This wasn't unique to Genghis Khan. Across empires, powerful men took conquered women to cement their rule. But the Mongols refined the practice, almost bureaucratized it. These unions were logged, ranked, and controlled. A concubine could be promoted. A wife could lose favor and vanish into the folds of history. There were no guarantees, only ranks to climb or fall from, and for some, climbing worked. A few concubines rose to oversee ordos, manage political affairs, or even act as intermediaries between nomadic and urban cultures. But such power was precarious, entirely dependent on the emperor's will in the end. Every marriage in the Mongol court served a larger purpose. The woman became a thread in a vast political web, woven tightly, beautifully, and often invisibly. So when we read of queens born from conquest, we must ask, were they survivors, or were they still prisoners, just wearing finer clothes? In the sprawling empire of Genghis Khan, not all women were equal, not even among the hundreds who shared his bed. To outsiders, the Mongol harem might seem like a blur. Wives, concubines, attendants, all part of one luxurious, hidden world. But to those inside, there was structure, there were rules, there was hierarchy. At the top stood Bert, the Khan's first and only empress. Her sons were the only legitimate heirs. No matter how many women followed, none could outrank her. Below Bert, a carefully tiered system of secondary wives and concubines existed, each woman's rank determined by origin, timing, and favor. Women of royal blood, captured princesses, or noble daughters, often held higher positions. Some were granted titles and their own ordo, or mobile camp. These ordos were not simply tents, they were miniature courts, staffed with servants, soldiers, herds, and stewards. A woman who managed her own ordo had responsibilities, political influence, and visibility. She could host guests, she could receive gifts, she could issue commands. Concubines, however, had no such power unless elevated. Many came from lower ranks, captives, gifted women, or those chosen for beauty. They might serve directly in the main court, in the personal tent of the Khan, or under the supervision of higher-ranking wives. Their lives were often quiet, regulated, and confined. But even among concubines, there was movement. A woman who bore a son could rise in status. A favorite could be granted more wealth, a better tent, or even her own ordo. In the Mongol world, favor could be as powerful as birth. To keep order, court, stewards, fofin, eunuchs, or elder women maintained detailed records. Every visit, every gift, every child was logged. The system ensured not just fairness, but control. It also reduced conflict, at least on the surface, but below the surface, tensions brewed. A woman passed over might lose influence. A child without status might be quietly set aside. Alliances formed behind tent flaps. Some women lobbied for attention. Others simply waited, fading into the folds of the empire's memory. And still, the hierarchy persisted. It was as much a part of Mongol governance as taxation or military command. It made the harem not a place of pleasure, but a silent battlefield, where status could rise or vanish with a whisper. So one must wonder, in a world so carefully ranked, could any woman truly feel secure? Or was every soft word just a step in a silent war? In the candlelit privacy of the Mongol harem, ambition took a quieter form. There were no courtesans plotting loudly in gilded halls, no poisoned goblets or dramatic betrayals. Power here flowed more subtly through timing, childbirth, and the art of staying indispensable. And yet, the idea of sleeping your way up in the Mongol court is a modern projection, a phrase far too crude for a world so structured. For a woman in Genghis Khan's empire, advancement wasn't seduction, it was survival strategy. A concubine who bore a healthy son might suddenly find herself with better tents, more servants, and a stake in succession politics. But this wasn't guaranteed. sons could die, political winds could shift, even the Khan's favor could fade faster than a desert breeze. One such case is told faintly in the Persian accounts of a concubine named Qualin, who bore a son, Tolui. While Bert's sons remained first in line, Tolui's descendants would one day rule vast parts of the empire, including the line that produced Kublai Khan. But Qualin herself remains little more than a name. She existed in shadow, close to power, but never quite visible. Another account describes women whose sons were fostered far away, raised not in luxury, but among nomads, learning survival. Their mothers, once hopeful of elevation, were quietly passed over. It wasn't just beauty or charm that earned rank. It was politics, timing, and whether your son lived long enough to matter. And yet, myths persist. European travelers like Marco Polo wrote of harems filled with women desperate for the Khan's attention, offering dances, songs, favors. But these accounts often mixed Mongol reality with the fantasies of their own courts. The truth was likely far more mundane. A concubine's most powerful asset wasn't allure, it was patience, obedience, and the hope of bearing children tied to a rising star. Even jealousy had its limits. The harem was managed like a political institution, with elder women, administrators, and watchers ensuring harmony, or at least the appearance of it. There was little room for chaos. Everyone had their place. Every night was scheduled so. Did anyone truly sleep her way to the top? Not exactly. But some did survive long enough, bear the right child, or outlast their rivals, and that was often enough. In a world where nothing was promised, stability itself was power. But this raises an unsettling question. If even the women closest to the emperor lived in a system of silent competition and fragile rank, what did winning actually look like? For most, the idea of home means permanence, a familiar bed, familiar walls, and predictable rest. But for Genghis Khan, home was movement. He did not sleep in palaces. He did not claim a capital. He slept wherever the empire moved next. This was no accident. The Mongol world revolved around the mobile encampment, a complex city of tents that could be packed up and moved in a day. Genghis Khan's personal camp, known as the Golden Ordo, traveled with him constantly. It was a hive of activity: soldiers, servants, guards, cooks, concubines, wives, and animals. But even within this camp, he rarely slept in the same tent more than once. There were practical reasons for this. Safety, above all. In a world of sudden assassinations and shifting alliances, unpredictability was its own form of protection. By sleeping in a different tent each night, sometimes in a different section of the Ordo, entirely, Genghis Khan made himself harder to target. Even his own guards often didn't know exactly where he'd sleep until moments before sunset. But there was more to it than that. This ritual of movement reinforced his mystique. In Mongol culture, leaders were not meant to appear soft, comfortable, or stationary. A Khan who slept too long in one place might appear weak, too trusting, or too dependent. Instead, the great leader became a ghost in his own camp, always present, yet always out of reach. He rotated not just tents, but companions. Each night, a different wife or concubine might be chosen to share his tent. This too was political. A visit meant favor. Favor meant gifts, resources, and potential advancement. But no one stayed long. Even Bert, the empress, shared his bed irregularly. The tents themselves were not luxurious by European standards. They were felt yurts, warm, yes, and layered, in furs and skins, but fundamentally simple. The Khan's own bed was often no more elaborate than those of his top generals. What made it different was who entered it and how often the location changed. And yet, this constant movement came at a cost. Rest became ritual. Every night was part of a system. There was no drifting off to sleep with the same familiar scent or the same view of the stars. Even sleep itself had to serve the empire rotated monitored. WEAPONIZED. So you might ask, when every bed is a throne, and every night a performance, did Genghis Khan ever sleep simply as a man, or only ever as a ruler? In the silence of the Mongol night, where the winds swept across open steppe and torchlight flickered through woolen tents, the question of who slept where was never left to chance. Every member of the Khan's vast traveling court, from generals, 2 concubines, wives, 2 watchmen, had a place assigned and reinforced by custom and command. This wasn't just for comfort. It was a map of power. Genghis Khan's own sleeping arrangements were guarded not just by elite warriors, but by rituals of proximity. His primary tent was surrounded by a ring of tents belonging to his most trusted menthekishig, his imperial guard. They, in turn, were surrounded by logistical aides, herdsmen, cooks, and administrators. Think of it as a breathing fortress, one where intimacy equaled importance. Inside the inner ring, space was political currency. A tent positioned closer to the Khan was a sign of favor. The wives or concubines, allowed to sleep in his vicinity or in his tent itself, weren't chosen solely for beauty or companionship. Their presence carried weight. A night with the Khan could result in a child. A child could become a prince, and a prince could inherit power. But sleeping arrangements extended beyond women. His generals, too, were placed with precision. If one fell out of favor, his tent might quietly be shifted further from the Khan. If a rising commander earned new trust, he might wake one morning to find his tent moved inward closer to the seat of power. There were even protocols for illness and dreams. If the Khan had a troubling dream, one recorded, notably, involved his horse, speaking to him, priests, shamans, and close advisors were summoned, not just to interpret it, but to rearrange his surroundings. Perhaps a tent had been wrongly placed. Perhaps a woman brought bad omens. Dreams dictated geography. And what about those who disturbed his sleep? Punishment could be swift. A soldier who shouted too near the Khan's tent, a cook who caused a disturbance, even a guard who stepped wrongly into the sacred sleeping perimeter. Any of these could be reassigned, demoted, or worse. Rest, in the world of empire, was sacred, and so Genghis Khan slept in a tent that changed nightly, surrounded by a world that bent itself around his breathing. Each pillow, each entrance flap, each rug had meaning. Even in his most private hours, he remained the center of a rotating universe. But this leads to a quieter, stranger thought. When power follows you into every sleep, does the man ever vanish beneath the weight of the Khan? In the shadow of Genghis Khan's empire, there were always whispers of lineage sons born to women whose names were never written down, daughters forgotten by scribes, and heirs raised in silence until summoned to serve. Genghis Khan fathered many children, dozens, hundreds, perhaps more. Official records acknowledged for sons by his principal wife, Bert, and numerous daughters. But unofficially, history becomes a soft murmur. Many of his concubines bore children whose names, though once whispered in palace circles, were eventually swallowed by time. These children were not all equally in the eyes of the court, the army, or even their father. Those born to Bert had the strongest claim. Joki, the eldest, led armies into Central Asia. Chagatai, Ogaday, and Tolui each took on administrative or military responsibilities, eventually carving the empire into successor states. Their names appear in documents, their movements tracked by scribes. But the children of concubines, they often existed in the edges of the empire, unnamed in records, known only to their mothers and a few close attendants. Yet their silence served a purpose. In a world driven by alliances, marriages, and clan loyalties, to many sons could become a danger. To few, and the bloodline risked extinction. Genghis Khan's answer was neither restraint nor chaos, it was strategy. He scattered his children like seeds across the steppe. Some were raised by their mothers' tribes, kept deliberately distant from the center of power. Others were taken into the care of loyal generals, trained from youth to ride, hunt, and govern. These children might one day command a garrison, govern a distant outpost, or marry into another clan. Their presence quietly stabilized the empire, without drawing attention to themselves or threatening the positions of birth sons. Interestingly, Genghis Khan rarely, if ever, declared public affection for his many offspring. His approval was earned through performance on the battlefield, in diplomacy, in restraint. Love was not a requirement. Loyalty was. What emerges then is not a family tree, but a web delicate, overlapping, and partly invisible. Many of these sons and daughters lived without the privileges of royalty. Some may never have met their father. Others, perhaps, served in his army without ever knowing they shared his blood. And so the question lingers in the dust of forgotten camps and ruined fortresses. How many children called him father, and how many never dared speak the word aloud? Long after Genghis Khan's death in 1227, his children, both named and unnamed, continued to shape the world in ways both visible and invisible. His official sons inherited the throne, divided the empire, and launched dynasties that would span generations. But what of the others? The quiet ones, the unrecorded ones, the ones whose blood was royal but whose names were lost. Some vanished entirely. In the Mongol world, lineage was powerful but fragile. A child born to a concubine might be recognized in youth, trained in riding and archery, and even given a command. But a shift in court politics, a failed campaign, or a misaligned marriage could erase him overnight. His tent might be struck in silence, his name removed from records, his memory buried not by time but by decision. But others endured not as individuals, but as echoes. Several noble families in Central Asia, Persia, and even China claimed descent from Genghis Khan across the centuries. These claims were sometimes real, sometimes invented. It didn't matter. The idea of being his descendant carried weight long after his death. Princes in Samarkand, Khans in the steppes, and even emperors in the Ming and Qing courts would trace or fabricate lines back to the great Khan. Blood became myth, ironically. Some of Genghis Khan's most influential descendants were not his sons at all but his daughters. His daughters married strategically. Their husbands often became governors or generals, but their daughters and sons carried on regional power with subtle brilliance. One daughter, Alakai Beki, governed northern China and wielded immense administrative influence. Another, Chechigan, married into the Oyat and helped stabilize Western territories. These women raised generations of rulers, who in turn raised more. The Khan's legacy, it seems, often ran strongest through the women history barely named. And then there were the shadows. The warriors who rode under Genghis, fierce and loyal, were often rumored to be of his blood, whether true or not. These whispers allowed certain commanders to rise faster. Lineage was more than biology, was a currency, a way to build trust or legitimacy in times of doubt. Today, millions of people are believed to carry fragments of Genghis Khan's DNA. But the irony remains, we know more about his empire than his children. The conqueror left monuments, laws, and legends, but when it came to family, he left behind a maze. And so we ask, if a bloodline shapes the world but leaves no name, does it still count as history or just a rumor riding in the wind? Everywhere Genghis Khan went, a camp followed. But this was no ordinary camp. It was a traveling city, quiet in its steps, immense in its reach, and utterly essential to the rise of an empire, called the Ordu. This mobile headquarters moved across the steppe with practiced grace. At first glance, it might seem like just a cluster of yurts, those round felt-covered tents with wooden frames. But in truth, it was a carefully organized system, a microcosm of empire. Soldiers, wives, scribes, children, cooks, and horses all lived and moved together, each knowing their place in the living rhythm of the Ordu. Its heart was the great white yurt, where Genghis Khan slept, met his advisors, and issued commands. It was built on a cart with massive wooden wheels and pulled by teams of oxen. It could take hours just to set it up or take it down. But once established, this tent became a center of power. Envoys would kneel at its threshold. Decisions that changed countenance were whispered inside. Surrounding the great yurt were the tents of his senior wives and sons, arranged in precise patterns according to tribal custom. Each had guards, each had livestock, each operated like a small court. Farther out were the quarters for attendants, generals, and administrators. Then the herds, thousands of sheep, goats, horses, and camels grazed under the watch of mounted herdsmen. Even farther, the supply wagons, which carried iron pots, grain sacks, saddles, arrows, and the Khan's vast hoard of plunder. But this was more than logistics. The Ordu was a living symbol of Genghis Khan's command. Where it stopped, the empire breathed. Where it moved, it meant war or diplomacy, punishment or reward. It never lingered too long in one place. Grass could not be overgrazed. Horses needed new pastures. And so the whole city, tens of thousands of people and animals, would rise like smoke and vanish toward the horizon. What made it remarkable wasn't just its size or mobility, but its discipline. Orders were followed without hesitation. No shouting, no disorder. Fires were lit at the same time each evening. Children knew not to stray too far. Even animals moved in set routes. At night, when the wind quieted and the stars emerged, the camp glowed with hundreds of small fires and the distant calls of guards riding perimeter routes. It was peaceful, almost eerily so, and yet you couldn't help but wonder, what secrets did this wandering city carry with it hidden beneath canvas and moonlight? By day, the Ordu moved with order. By night, it murmured with the sound of decisions being made in the dark. Inside the main tent, Genghis Khan held council, not with fanfare, but with focus. There were no thrones, no silk carpets, no halls, just firm-packed earth, low stools, and a small fire. His generals sat cross-legged, his secretaries waited with ink-stained hands, and he, the Khan, listened. He asked questions, simple ones. Where is the river? How many horses did we lose last moon? Who is feeding the southern prisoners? His power wasn't loud, it was sharp, like wind at high altitude. Each answer shaped what would happen next. Entire cities could be spared or razed based on a sentence spoken beside that fire. Beyond this inner circle, Runners slipped between tents, carrying coded orders. These messages, carved on small wooden tablets, or whispered from memory, would ride out with the sun. Some carried battle plans, others news of a commander's promotion or execution. But it wasn't just strategy that made the orju function. It was routine. Every night, fires were lit in concentric rings. Guards were posted in rotations that never changed. Women prepared food and mended clothes by torchlight. Children were taught how to pack a tent in under 10 minutes. Livestock were rotated in patterns to avoid overgrazing. The rhythm never faltered, even in snow or sandstorm. Discipline kept the orju alive. Punishment, when needed, came quickly. A stolen goat meant lashes. Disobedience meant exile. In a world where every ounce of meat, milk, and water mattered, there was no room for chaos. Even nobles followed the rules. One of Genghis Khan's own sons was publicly rebuked for drinking without sharing. Another was demoted for cowardice. But there was a softness to quiet and easily missed. Old men told stories to children outside the cooking fires. Musicians played stringed horsehead fiddles after dinner. Widows braided one another's hair. And sometimes, if the stars were especially clear, people lay awake and watched the sky, murmuring about spirits and ancestors. In that stillness, you might ask, what was it like to live at the center of the world, but feel like you never stopped moving? While Genghis Khan rode into foreign lands, burning, building, and bargaining, his wives remained behind. Not idle, not ornamental, but powerful in ways history rarely lingers on. Among them, one name rose in whispers: Sorgatani Beki. She wasn't the Khan's wife, but his daughter-in-law married to his son, Tolui. And when the old conqueror died and the empire split among heirs, it was Sorgatani who stepped into the silence and filled it with policy, diplomacy, and strategy. She never led armies. She didn't wear armor. But she governed entire regions with a hand so skilled, even rival empires took notice. In a world dominated by warriors, she ruled by outlasting everyone. From her court in northern China, she managed more than tents and tribute. She oversaw grain storage, river irrigation, tax collection, and legal disputes. Every messenger, merchant, and magistrate who passed through her lands had to follow her rule. She was fair but firm. She refused to drink alcohol, unlike many Mongol nobles. She educated her sons rigorously, teaching them to speak Chinese, Persian, and Mongolian. She hired scholars, not flatterers. Her household ran with precision, perhaps even more so than her late father-in-law's court. But Sorgatani was playing a longer game. Her sons, 4 of them, were raised not just as princes, but as future rulers. And while other Mongol nobles squabbled over land and title, she quietly positioned her children to inherit the future. The historian Juvayni, a Persian chronicler, wrote of her with rare admiration. Of all the women of the Mongols, she was the most intelligent and able. She may never have swung a sword, but she wielded something sharper, patience. When her husband Tolui died, likely from alcohol poisoning, Sorgatani refused to remarry. She remained a widow, keeping control over her estates and sons. Some questioned this decision, but she was no fool. A second marriage might strip her of influence. Alone, she could rule. She made alliances with religious leaders, protected minority faiths, and ensured Christian, Muslim, and Buddhist communities flourished under her watch. Where some leaders sought to unify through control, she ruled through balance. And while the rest of the empire churned with war, betrayal, and shifting borders, Sorgatani stayed steady, watching, planning, waiting. But even then, how did she convince brutal warlords and ambitious generals to follow a woman who carried no sword? Sorgatani Beki wasn't content to survive the Mongol world. She intended to shape its future. After the death of her husband, she remained at the center of power, quietly managing one of the most fertile and politically crucial regions in the empire. She had no official title, no ceremonial throne, but couriers, governors, and merchants bowed to her authority. And her greatest act of governance, raising emperors. Her eldest son was Mangai, a quiet boy with sharp eyes and a thoughtful demeanor. While other Mongol princes trained with bow and horse, Mongolia also learned tax systems, Chinese bureaucracy, and Persian diplomacy. His mother insisted on it. He would not only ride into battle, he would know how to run an empire. When the question of succession arose after Genghis Khan's death, the Mongol court fractured. Brothers turned against cousins, factions formed, accusations of poisoning, betrayal, and unfitness to rule echoed from Karakoram to Baghdad. The great machine of empire stalled, and it was then that Sorgatani made her move. She traveled across the empire, not with armies, but with gifts, letters, envoys, and whispers. She negotiated, persuaded, promised. Her quiet diplomacy outmaneuvered louder, bloodier contenders. She formed an alliance with Batu Khan of the Golden Horde, Genghis's grandson and ruler of the western frontiers. Batu was no friend to her rivals and, with his support, the council leaned in her favor. In 1251, the Kurultitha Grand Assembly declared Mongai Khan, the great Khan of the Mongol Empire. It was not a victory for one man, but for the woman. Behind him, under Mungik's rule, the empire consolidated. Roads were repaired, trade flourished, taxes were reorganized. Even foreign scholars praised his fairness. But behind that stability stood a legacy of planning that was undeniably his mother's. Her other sons, too, shaped history. Hulagu would lead the destruction of Baghdad and establish the Ilkhanate in Persia. Kublai Khan would go on to rule China and found the Yuan dynasty, and all of them credited Sorgatani's guidance. She died quietly in 1252, just 1 year after Mungik's rise. She asked for no monument, no tomb of gold, just a burial near her home. But her fingerprints remained on maps, on laws, in the policies of her sons, and the structure of the empire itself. She proved that power did not need a sword, that influence could be built patiently, strategically, without ever leading a charge. And yet, in the silence after her death, one question lingered. How many empires were truly ruled by kings? And how many were only echoing the plans of women behind the tent flaps? In a world obsessed with bloodlines, heirs, and legacy, the eunuchs of Genghis Khan's court were outsiders, men who could never father children, never start dynasties, never threaten the ruling family. And yet they often knew everything. They were present where others were not allowed. In harems, in planning tents, in private chambers, they poured the wine, carried the letters, listened, and remembered. While generals rode to conquest, eunuchs remained at the empire's heart, watching, recording, surviving. Their names rarely appear in the grand chronicles, but fragments remain mentions in Persian travelogues, Chinese memorials, and secret court documents. One such figure was Yelu Chukai's assistant, a eunuch whose name has been lost, but whose influence was not. As the empire expanded, this eunuch served as a translator between Mongolian, Chinese, and Persian dignitaries. He had no official military rank, but he arranged meetings between warring factions, soothed cultural tensions, and quietly corrected misinterpretations that could have sparked bloodshed. Others served directly in the Ordo, the imperial court. There, they handled the most sensitive correspondence, love letters from concubines, orders from queens, financial records of household spending. With no children of their own, they were considered trustworthy. No temptation to embezzle for a future son. No ambition for dynastic power. But perhaps the most surprising role they played was intelligence. Some eunuchs acted as spies, not only within the Mongol court, but in enemy territories. They could move unnoticed, often mistaken for servants or dismissed as harmless. In cities like Samarkand, Nishapur, and Luoyang, Mongol eunuchs collected whispers and transmitted them back by trade routes, coded into merchant manifests or prayer scrolls. Why did Genghis Khan, a man known for harsh efficiency, tolerate such people in his inner circle? Because they were useful. Eunuchs were trained from childhood in observation, loyalty, and service. Many were educated in multiple languages, and unlike ambitious nobles, they had no stake in succession crises. They served the institution, not the family. And Genghis understood that sometimes the safest counsel comes from those with nothing to gain. And yet their existence raises quiet questions. What stories were lost because they had no descendants to tell them? What secrets died with them sealed behind lips trained never to speak out of turn? We remember emperors, warlords, and queens, but history is full of shadows. And in Genghis Khan's sprawling empire, the most silent shadows moved behind every curtain, carrying messages, managing desire, and guarding 1,000 hidden doors. But if they held such trust, what happened when one of them betrayed it? It began with a cup of tea poured just a little too early in the imperial court. Timing was everything. A eunuch's task wasn't just to serve, but to read the room. When a senior wife hesitated before lifting her bowl, a eunuch knew whether it meant anger, anxiety, or grief. When a general stepped from a war meeting flushed and sweating, they guessed whether it was nerves or betrayal. The Mongol Empire's eunuchs didn't write history, but they often delivered it by hand, by voice, in whispered exchanges between tent flaps. When Genghis Khan inherited the throne, his mother Sorgatani had passed, but her network of loyal servants, including eunuchs, remained. They ensured safe passage for decrees. They warned of rebellion in distant provinces. They even gathered reports from brothels and tea-houses where discontented traders spoke too freely. But in time, not all eunuchs remained loyal. One, unnamed in official records, but preserved in a Persian chronicle, was accused of delivering falsified orders to a Mongol garrison in Central Asia. The order supposedly from Mongolia mandated the execution of a governor. The signature was convincing. The seal was perfect. But the language, it was just slightly off. The governor was executed. But weeks later, the forgery was discovered. The eunuch vanished. Some say he was sent by a rival royal faction. Others believe he had fallen under the influence of a Chinese rebel court. Either way, it shattered the illusion that eunuchs were entirely neutral, and so new protocols were established. Eunuchs carrying orders were now required to travel in pairs, and each message was copied twice, one sealed in a royal chest, another delivered openly. Trust was no longer automatic. Even the most loyal servants now operated under scrutiny. Still, the empire could not do without them. Eunuchs continued to oversee supply chains in peacetime. They mediated disputes in royal harems, where jealousy among wives could easily turn fatal. They documented gifts and tributes from across the empire, jewels from India, silks from China, horses from the steppe sand, balanced the ledgers of an empire too vast to touch all at once. But they walked a delicate line. Too much influence, and they became suspect. Too little, and they disappeared into anonymity. To be a eunuch in Genghis Khan's world was to live in a state of constant alert, watching, listening, never quite belonging. And yet, perhaps no one understood the empire's true heartbeat better than they did those who served in silence, with no family name to protect, and no descendants to carry their memory. They left no legacy of blood, but they did leave something else behind. Who guards the empire when even the rulers cannot trust their kin? The steppe wind was relentless, gritty, dry, and indifferent. Dust clung to armor, sweat baked into fabric, and riding for days meant sharing your saddle with your own filth. But even in these conditions, Genghis Khan bathed regularly, but the Mongols took cleanliness seriously. The ruling elite. It was not just about hygiene. Bathing was a ritual of control. Inside the tent, water was heated over a small brazier, stones gathered, and always no fewer than 4 servants were present. 2 to tend to the water, 1 to fan the steam, and 1 trusted eunuch to oversee the process. Each had their role memorized. One misstep could lead to death. These bathing sessions were more than personal care. They were opportunities. It was during these times, when the Khan was most relaxed, that couriers would deliver messages, generals might be summoned, and sometimes wives or concubines would be sent in, though never without warning. But no one could enter the tent unannounced. Mongol law treated the bathing tent as sacrosanct. Violating its privacy was considered treasonous, sometimes for hours. The bath also served a medicinal purpose. After battle, the Khan's body was often bruised, strained, or wounded. Here, in warm water, he received massage, wound cleaning, and herbal treatment. The empire could not afford an infected scratch to claim its emperor. Interestingly, Mongol baths were not about immersion like Roman-style soaking pools. Instead, they focused on steam and pouring, a careful, controlled cleansing. The belief was that full-body submersion weakened the spirit. Instead, hot water was poured gently over the shoulders, while the Khan sat wrapped in linen soaked with herbal decoctions. At times, the tent was filled with silence. Signs from Tengri, the eternal sky, or omens read in the color of the Khan's urine, which was always inspected after bathing. One bath tent remained standing even during major military campaigns. It was erected next to the war tent, and when the Khan vanished into its veils of steam, no one spoke unless spoken to. Yet within those misty hours, policy was sometimes shaped, lives decided, wars postponed or declared. So how could something so intimate, so mundane, become a tool of empire? And more curiously, who else bathed in those tents, unseen by history? To serve in Genghis Khan's bathing tent was not a lowly task, it was a position of extreme trust and constant fear. The servants who bathed the Khan were selected as children. They were trained not in weapons, but in silence. Before they ever touched a water basin or folded a towel, they learned the most important rule: what is seen is forgotten, what is heard does not exist. But of course, they saw everything. They knew which wife the Khan favored based on the frequency of her visits after dusk. They saw the scars he hid beneath his armor. They noticed when his hands trembled in winter, or when his breath came slow after riding. These were the kinds of details that generals never saw, but the bath servants did. Over time, these attendants formed a silent network, not of spies, but of witnesses. They never left messages, but they shared glances. A furrowed brow during a water change might mean a military campaign was going poorly. A hurried setup of the steam tent meant the Khan was agitated. And once, when an unknown visitor was seen exiting the bath at night. The next morning brought news of a secret treaty. Their power was dangerous. To speak of it was treason. But some still found ways to leverage their role. One former servant, named in the annals, was quietly married into a minor noble house. Another vanished and was later rumored to be advising Genghis Khan himself. No one ever asked how such men gained the Khan's favor, but it wasn't just political secrets they held. The servants also managed the emotional balance of the imperial tent. If the Khan was in mourning, they adjusted the steam to be cooler and used no scented herbs. If he had returned from battle, they applied gentle oils to wounds, mixed from garlic, mare's milk, and steppe moss. These were not spa rituals, they were triage done in the quiet privacy of canvas walls. Sometimes, though, even they could not help. There was one occasion, recorded in the secret histories, when Genghis Khan refused to be bathed. For 3 days, no steam rose from the tent. Servants were dismissed. The wind blew cold. Some say it was after a failed vision quest. Others whisper that he had seen an omen in his sleep. Eventually, the tent reopened. The routine resumed, but no one ever asked what had happened in those silent days. And in the final months of his life, it was the bath servants, those quiet shadows, who were allowed nearest to him. When even his wives and generals waited outside, it was they who brought warm cloth to his head, poured water on his chest, and listened to the sound of an empire breathing its last. But what might they have whispered to each other after he was gone? When you think of Mongol power, you likely picture warriors thundering across the steppes, banners high, arrows loosed, and dust in their wake. But behind those warriors, behind even the great Khan himself, stood women who never commanded armies, yet shaped the world from behind closed felt walls. One such woman was Sorgatani Beki, a Nestorian Christian and daughter-in-law of Genghis Khan. While her name has been studied, her daughters, both biological and political, have largely faded into the dust of history. Yet they ruled. Sorgatani was married to Tolui, Genghis Khan's youngest and most volatile son. She bore him 4 sons, including the future great Khan Mongai and the famously ruthless Kublai Khan. But she also raised a circle of nieces and daughters of the empire, teaching them literacy, court strategy, and, above all, how to survive in a world built for men with swords. These women, though rarely named, were sent to rule distant regions of the empire, not as figureheads, but as active administrators. In Mongolia, in northern China, and across Central Asia, princesses presided over courts, managed trade routes, negotiated peace terms, and even led ritual ceremonies meant to stabilize conquered populations. Some were married off as diplomatic tokens, yes, but once installed, they often took full charge of their new territories. Their husbands might have the military rank, but the day-to-day governance, resource allocation, and negotiation with local chieftains fell to these women. One unnamed granddaughter of Sorgatani was sent to rule over a restless Turkic town near Samarkand. Within months, she restructured grain distribution and halted a famine. Another ran a spy network that reported directly to Karakoram, intercepting uprisings before they erupted. Most historians ignore these women because they didn't lead cavalry charges, but power in the Mongol world wasn't always loud. Often, it was whispered through tents, lined with silk maps and foreign coinage. Even their education was exceptional. While Mongol boys learned to ride and shoot by the age of 4, these girls were taught Persian arithmetic, Chinese etiquette, and Mongol tribal law. It was not kindness, it was strategy. Sorgatani knew that daughters could be just as deadly as sons, if armed with the right knowledge. And knowledge was power that didn't rust or bleed. Though the empire would eventually fracture into khanates, many of these women continued to act as interkhanate liaisons, writing letters, translating languages, and making sure alliances were honored. Their presence didn't make the history books, but their absence would have caused the empire to collapse far earlier. But how much of their influence was intentional? Were they simply survivors of empire? Were they its quiet architects? Most Mongol princesses were married off early, not for love, but for land. A marriage wasn't just a celebration, it was a contract, a diplomatic tool, a calculated move on the chessboard of empire. Brides were often sent hundreds of miles away to marry Turkic khans, Persian governors, or Tangut warlords. In return, their dowries came in the form of peace treaties, trade routes, or fortified loyalty. But not all Mongol princesses went quietly. Some refused. One of the most remarkable was Kutalun, the great-great-granddaughter of Genghis Khan. She was a warrior famous for wrestling. Every suitor who tried to win her hand, and she never lost. She demanded that any man who wished to marry her must defeat her in a match. If they lost, they had to surrender horses dozens at a time. By the time she was in her 20s, she had amassed over 10,000 horses, a herd that large was not just wealthy, was power. But Kutalun wasn't alone in her resistance. Throughout the 13th and 14th centuries, multiple women from Sorgatani's line either refused marriage altogether or agreed only under strict conditions. These weren't just rebellions of pride, they were political strategies. In some cases, these princesses were more useful unmarried, as single women tied directly to the Khan's bloodline. They could be dispatched as royal administrators or envoys without becoming absorbed into another family's lineage. Their authority remained intact, their allegiances unquestioned in the Chagatai Khanate. One such princess ruled a district near modern-day Uzbekistan for nearly 2 decades. Though local records survive only in fragments, Chinese sources refer to her court as a place of strange discipline, where tribute was collected with precision and no foreign official was permitted to sit in her presence. No husband is ever mentioned. Of course, these women walked a knife's edge. Too much independence, and they risked accusations of sorcery or sedition. Too little, and they would be forgotten entirely. So they balanced their lives between ceremony and strategy, weaving influence through household staff, midwives, scribes, and caravan leaders. Even the Khan's court could not always contain them. In one account, a princess allegedly poisoned her own arranged husband before consummation, citing a vision from Tengri, the sky god. Whether true or not, the tale was enough to stop further marriage attempts for years. Their stories rarely made the imperial scrolls, but their decisions not to marry, not to bear children, not to leave their homelands stippled through the governance of the entire Mongol world. And yet, we still don't know their names. Were they erased, or did they choose to vanish quietly, their power hidden behind the silk walls of tents and the ink of unsigned decrees? In the outer halls of the Mongol court, marriages were weapons, less romantic bonds, and more carefully forged alliances. But one such union proved to be far more volatile than anyone could have predicted. It wasn't between emperors or khans, but between a lesser-known Mongol nobleman and a woman named Ogul Kamisha, name history almost lost, had she not nearly stolen the empire. Ogul Kamish entered the imperial fold as the wife of Gyak Khan, the grandson of Genghis and son of Gedai. Gyak was not the most charismatic or visionary of leaders, but his wife had ambitions that far outpaced his. From the moment she stepped into the palace in Karakoram, Oghul immersed herself in court networks. She gained influence through priestesses, astrologers, and merchants from the Silk Road. While Gyak drank and dallied with minor officials, she made alliances, quiet ones, female ones. But when Gyak suddenly died in 1248, the fragile peace between the Mongol Khanates trembled. A new great Khan had to be chosen, and many looked westward to Batu of the Golden Horde. But Oghul had other plans. Rather than retreat to the sidelines as a mourning widow, she seized control as regent for her young sons. This was bold bordering on suicidal in Mongol politics. Regents were almost never women, especially not ones without battlefield experience. But Oghul had no interest in wielding swords. She ruled through information. She kept the courier routes running. She redistributed grain. She summoned Buddhist lamas, Muslim scholars, and Christian priests, playing them off one another. Even Marco Polo, though writing decades later, mentions women like Herthos, who governed from behind the veil, with whisper and wine. Oghul soon began orchestrating the election of a new Khanate, one backed by Batu or by Sorghutani's sons, but someone she could control. And here her overreach began, when she tried to bypass Menengi, Sorghutani's powerful son, and instead appoint her own loyalist. It sent a ripple through the empire. Lines were drawn. Support began to fall away. Yet, for a time, Oghul held the empire in limbo, neither yielding nor crowned, commanding caravans and coin, as though nothing had changed. She had no army, she had no title, but she held the seal of the empire in her lap, and dared the sons of Genghis to take it from her. What gave her that confidence? Was it desperation, or had she seen something the men of the steppe had missed? Oghul held on for nearly 3 years, 3 years of balancing loyalties, managing court ceremonies, and dispatching letters in the name of her dead husband. 3 years of holding the empire in political limbo, with no elected great Khan, and no unified chain of command. But in the shadows, Sorghutani's son Menengi was preparing his move. By 1251, Menengi had gathered enough support from across the Khanates, from Batu in the west, from Chinese advisors in the east, and from the vast military loyal to his father's legacy. He summoned a Kurultai, a royal council, to formalize his election as Great Khan. Oghul refused to attend. She declared the meeting illegitimate. She claimed it violated Mongol custom. But in truth, she likely knew what awaited her there: disgrace, exile, or worse. So she stayed in Karakoram, clinging to the last shreds of imperial ceremony, hoping that silence could slow the tide. It didn't. Once Mungay was confirmed, his first act was to eliminate opposition. He marched on Karakoram with his generals, and entered the palace unopposed. Oghul was arrested not as a widow, not even as a failed regent, but as a traitor. What followed was not swift. For months, she was imprisoned and interrogated, not in chains, but in isolation. Mongol records suggest she was examined by poison, a euphemism for slow ritual humiliation. Menengi had no desire for her blood. He wanted her submission. But Oghul never confessed, never begged, never recognized his rule, so they executed her. She was wrapped in felt, the traditional Mongol method of noble execution. No blood was shed. Her breath was simply smothered from her, her body quietly removed from court records. And yet, the story would not disappear. Women remembered her. Some praised her boldness, others warned against her pride, but none forgot the widow who ruled an empire without title, without army, and without ever lifting a sword. and in an odd twist of legacy, it was Oghul-Kimish's fall that solidified Mungik's legitimacy. Her resistance made his claim seem more necessary, more justified, more divine. She became the final test of his rise. Centuries later, historians would debate, was she merely ambitious, or did she represent an older Mongol tradition, a world where women ruled as stewards, where power was fluid, and where survival demanded not might, but mastery of silence. If Oghul-Kimish had succeeded, would the empire have looked different? Would diplomacy have replaced conquest? Would the women of the Khanates have kept their thrones? Or was hers the last flicker of a dying flame, one final attempt to hold onto a version of power that the coming generations would never allow again? If Genghis Khan built an empire with blood and fire, Kublai Khan gilded it with gold and silk. By the late 13th century, the Mongol Empire had transformed. The rough yurts of the steppe gave way to tiled palaces in Dadu, modern-day Beijing, and at the center of Kublai's court, beneath soaring pagodas and lacquered ceilings, moved a group of women whose names were seldom recorded but whose roles were unmistakably powerful. The imperial courtesans. These were not mere entertainers. They were trained in languages, music, calligraphy, dance, and most importantly, discretion. They were not wives, yet held influence over policy. They were not spies, but every conversation they heard was reported. Their presence in the court was both an art and a mechanism of surveillance. The courtesans were selected through a process that blended Confucian examination with Mongol practicality. Girls as young as 12 were tested not just for beauty, but for memory, poise, and political awareness. The finest among them were brought to the palace and placed under the care of eunuch instructors. Their education was relentless. Mandarin poetry at dawn, etiquette drills by noon, and lute practice in the evening when guests arrived from Persia or Venice or India. It was often the courtesans, not the generals, who greeted them first. Draped in embroidered robes, they poured tea, recited verses, and made subtle observations about the visitor's tone, language, and intent. That information was quietly passed on to the court officials. In Kublai's sprawling cosmopolitan empire, trust was rare, and the courtesans became the ears of the throne. But they were also tools of diplomacy. When trade envoys overstayed their welcome, a song performed by a courtesan might signal it was time to leave. When rebellions stirred in far provinces, one might be dispatched as a gift to the rebellious governor, a gesture of grace, but also a reminder that the court was watching. These women lived within layers of silk and formality, yet they were never truly free. Their beauty was curated, their movements scheduled, their futures tied entirely to the favor of men who viewed them as both treasure and tool. Still, some rose above it. One known only in records as Lady Baihua, White Flower, gained such influence over Kublai that she was rumored to have shaped border policy between China and Tibet. Others orchestrated small reforms in the palace kitchens, or arranged better education for the daughters of court servants. What drove these women to master such a delicate life? Was it survival, ambition, or did they truly believe they could guide the empire from behind a painted fan? Despite their graceful presence in the court, the courtesans of Kublai Khan were far from ornamental. Behind the silken screens and ritualistic bows, they maintained a quiet infrastructure of influence, one that spanned beyond the palace halls and into the heart of Mongol politics. Some, like Lady Baihua, became unofficial advisors. Though she never held a title, her presence at state dinners and war councils became a familiar sight. She rarely spoke in public, but in private, her voice reached the ears of generals, ministers, Minister Zaven the Khan himself. The chronicles suggest she was instrumental in smoothing tensions with Tibetan monks, advocating a softer policy of patronage over conquest. Others acted as intermediaries between factions. When rival courtiers plotted, it was often the courtesans who first heard the whispers, and with a careful word spoken or withheld, they could shift a tide. A misplaced compliment here, an absent greeting there, these small gestures could ripple through court ranks, altering careers and alliances. But influence had limits. Courtesans were forbidden from marrying unless released by the Khan, and few were. They lived within the court's inner sanctum, in residences known as the Red Pavilions. These were not prisons, but they were not homes either. Life there was comfortable, but curated each moment, watched by eunuchs each relationship. Recorded aging courtesans faced an uncertain future. Some were granted lands and titles upon retirement, though rarely near the capital. Others became teachers for the next generation, passing on not just the arts, but the coded behaviors that kept one alive in court. And some simply vanished from the records' names, erased when they were no longer useful, yet the system endured. Kublai Khan, ever the pragmatist, understood that soft power could extend further than arrows. Where generals demanded obedience, courtesans inspired loyalty. Where diplomacy faltered, poetry soothed tensions. And where enemies hid behind smiles, it was often the women of the inner court who uncovered the truth, but their silence was institutional. The chronicles of the Yuan dynasty mention the courtesans, sparingly names left out. Roles blurred, their deeds attributed to luck or fortune, and yet the empire they moved through ran more smoothly with them in it. Did they ever dream of freedom? Or had they mastered a different kind of agency, one woven into silk, not shouted from horses? The courtesans lived in a world where knowledge was currency and silence was survival. They thrived without power, shaped policy without credit, and faded without monuments. Yet, without them, how many of the Khan's victories would have unraveled? To build the largest land empire in history, Genghis Khan needed more than warriors. He needed a network. That network was called the Yam, a sprawling system of relay stations that stretched across Asia like a vast web of dusty roads, stables, and wooden huts. Designed for speed and control, the Yam allowed messengers to travel hundreds of miles a day, changing horses at designated outposts every 25 to 30 miles. But what's often forgotten is who kept this system alive at nearly every station. Especially those deeper into settled territories lived women wives, widows, daughters tasked with managing the flow of traffic, food, and information. Historians rarely name them, but they were there, recorded in duty rosters and supply logs as caretakers, record keepers, and cooks. Without them, the entire Yam would have collapsed under the weight of dust and exhaustion. These women didn't ride the horses, but they made sure the horses were ready. They didn't deliver the messages, but they ensured the couriers were fed, clothed, and watched. If a messenger arrived half frozen from the steppes, it was a station matron who wrapped him in furs and poured him hot mare's milk. If one failed to appear, she'd report the absence to the next rider, sometimes days before official notice reached the capital. In some stations, the role of the women grew beyond logistics. At larger hubs, they managed entire inventories of livestock, regulated grain consumption, and even kept watch over political correspondence, recording which messages passed through and when. A sharp memory and a subtle gaze were as important as the cook fire. These were not idle homemakers, they were postmasters in all but name. Many were wives of soldiers, left behind while their husbands rode with the Khan. Some were retired camp followers, seasoned women who had marched in campaigns and knew how to keep order with a word and a glance. Others were simply locals, absorbed into the system by marriage or necessity. They formed a strange sisterhood, sisterlated from each other, yet bound by the same dusty rhythm of hoofbeats and boiling kettles. Their days were long and repetitive, cleaning tack, boiling broth, grooming horses, and counting dispatches. Yet they played a crucial role in the empire's speed, surveillance, and cohesion. The yam wasn't just a communication tool, it was how Genghis Khan ruled. Orders could only be obeyed if they were received. Rebellions could only be crushed if news of them traveled fast. So who were these women who waited in wooden huts on the edge of the world? Did they feel pride in their role, or were they simply surviving in the shadow of conquest? The couriers came and went, carrying letters sealed with the Khan's authority. But the women of the yam remained. They were the anchors in a system designed for constant motion. While the Mongol elite chased the seasons and the soldiers followed war, these women dug in. They tended goats, mended roofs, raised children, and maintained the fragile illusion of permanence in a world always on the move. And they did it alone. Men passed through, sons, riders, tax collectors, but rarely stayed. For some women, a courier's return meant a few moments of conversation, a shared bowl of soup, a hint of news from the capital. For others, it meant bad news, a missing husband, a son lost in battle, or the silent acknowledgement that no message was coming at all. Many of the wives and widows ran their stations for decades. The empire's records, sparse though they are, include station mothers, older women granted small stipends for their years of loyalty. These were the quiet bureaucrats of the steppe, known not for their literacy, but for their memory. They knew which horse had colic last winter, which rider drank too much kumis, and which routes were impassable in spring. And they understood the value of discretion. Though imperial messengers rode with sacred authority, espionage traveled the same routes. Rival khans, rogue princes, and foreign spies tried to infiltrate the yam. It was often the station women who noticed something off a rider who lingered too long. A scroll that smelled of tampering, a coded phrase repeated too carefully. Their reports, when they dared to send them, helped keep the communication lines secure. Still, they received little recognition. They were not courtiers or warriors. Their homes were functional, not ceremonial wooden walls, blackened with smoke, floors covered in hard-packed earth. Their names rarely made it into chronicles, but their work shaped the fate of empires. As the Mongol world expanded into China, Persia, and Russia, the yam grew with it. And so too did the number of nameless women living beside roads, rivers, and ravines, keeping fires lit and horses warm in service of a distant, unseen ruler. They were never on the battlefield. Yet the victories of Genghis Khan and his descendants depended on the speed and efficiency of the messages they helped deliver. What did these women dream of in the quiet hours after sunset? Did they imagine their names written in scrolls, or did they simply pray for safety and warm horses? Their lives were small in the shadow of empire, but indispensable, not remembered perhaps, but never replaceable. When we speak of Genghis Khan's campaigns, we imagine horses, blood, fire, not birth, cries in the dark. Yet for every army that moved across the steppes, there followed a quieter force, the women who bore the next generation, and the midwives who delivered them. Mongol midwives, known as emshi, held one of the most demanding roles in the entire empire. They were not merely caretakers of birth, they were traveling medical officers, healers, advisors, and often the only ones standing between life and death in the fragile tents of war. Childbirth didn't wait for battles to end or weather to improve. Babies came during sieges, in forest camps, beside frozen rivers, and even in the heat of deserts. And when they did, a midwife had to be ready with herbal salves, boiled water, and hands made steady by years of practice. Their kits were simple: bone knives, swaddling cloths, copper basins, and a small pouch of herbs, garlic for infection, juniper for fumigation, and dried mare's milk to fortify a weak mother. They traveled lightly, for they had to ride fast when called. Some were old women, others young apprentices, all of them trained through oral knowledge passed from woman to woman. Unlike the rest of Mongol society, which often prioritized men in status and record, midwives were given a strange, unspoken respect. Life was power, and those who brought it forth earned a kind of reverence that didn't require scrolls or ceremony. In camp life, a midwife could command silence with a single gesture. Even generals would step aside when a child was being born. Midwives also served as caretakers of fertility and health. They advised on spacing pregnancies, treating infections, soothing menstrual pains, and tending to miscarriages. They might mix salves from sheep's fat and pine ash, or whisper charms handed down through generations. Their medicine was part practical, part mystical, and both were deeply trusted, and not all their patients were Mongols. When the Mongol Empire expanded, many conquered peoples, Chinese, Persian, Slavic, found themselves under the care of Mongol midwives, sometimes out of necessity, sometimes due to the dismantling of local systems. These emchi became the bridge between traditions. But what happened when a birth went wrong? There were no surgeons, no painkillers, only the midwife, a mother in agony, and a world outside the tent that could not stand, would not pause. How did these women carry those nights? Their hands bore life. Their silence bore the weight of death. And when the sun rose, they packed their things and rode on. Some nights ended with a new life. Others ended with a stillness so deep it outlasted the wind. Inside a Mongol garowand, warm and low to the ground, the midwife knelt beside a woman who had labored too long. The fire crackled weakly in the center hearth, casting shadows along the wooden support poles that curved like ribs overhead. Outside, horses stamped in the frost. Inside, a silence settled in that no woman wanted to name. In Mongol tradition, if a child died at birth, it was mourned without ceremony. The spirit was believed to be too fragile, too unfinished, to carry a name. The midwife often bore this quiet grief alone, expected to move swiftly from loss to duty. No records were kept, no graves marked, just a swaddled bundle taken away before dawn. And if the mother died, that was different. The death of a mother shook the camp. It threatened the survival of children, disrupted the rhythms of daily life, and left men But even then, the midwife's work did not stop. She cleaned the body, wrapped it, and delivered the news with a measured voice, the same one she had used during the labor. She had no time for weeping, because somewhere else, another woman was entering labor. Another fire needed tending. Another child would arrive whether the world was ready or not. These women, these emchi, often bore their own scars. Torn during deliveries, burned by boiling water, weakened by long rides through cold. Some could no longer have children themselves, having spent years exposing their own bodies to infection and exhaustion. Yet they kept riding, kept delivering, kept returning to the tent with the blood-dark floor. There are accounts from Persian and Chinese observers who traveled the Mongol Empire and noted how organized, calm, and respected these birth attendants were. One diplomat remarked that a Mongol camp could fall into panic during a battle, but not during a birth. The midwife held her ground even when warriors did not. Yet we do not know their names. We do not know what became of the midwife, who rode into China with Kublai Khan, or the one who helped deliver a general's son by the river Volga. We only know their echoes, traces in the oral songs of steppe women, quiet respect in ethnographic records, and the simple fact that Genghis Khan's empire, with all its brutality and speed, still pauses just long enough for a child to be born. Perhaps that is how empires endure, not through conquest, but through the ones who hold new life in trembling hands.